Copperhead Strike might be the most underrated roller coaster I've ever ridden, and this is a ride that gets a lot of praise, but I think it deserves to be in consideration for one of the best coasters in the country. That's how good this ride is, and when I first rode it in 2022, it really cemented Mock Rides as one of my favorite manufacturers, because this and Time Traveler are just absolutely incredible, and then you throw in some awesome family coasters like Cobra's Curse, Manta at SeaWorld San Diego, Sierra Sidewinder at Knott's Berry Farm, and you have a really solid lineup of coasters, and I really want to see this company build more attractions in the United States. Before we dig into Copperhead Strike, please like, comment, and subscribe. I'm a very small coaster and theme park YouTube channel, so I appreciate every ounce of support. Thank you so much. So as I mentioned, I got to ride Copperhead Strike in 2022. I think I only rode it twice on that visit. That was actually a very last minute trip to Carowinds. The only reason I went was because American canceled one of my flights, so I was stuck in Charlotte. So I had a few hours to kill, so we went to Carowinds for a little bit. In 2024, I had a dedicated trip specifically for this park. I spent 3 days there, and over those 3 days, I believe I got 11 or 12 rides on Copperhead Strike. So I know this ride very well now, and I'm fully comfortable making this review. So Carowinds obviously has a big four in terms of roller coasters. There's this ride, Afterburn, Thunderstriker, and Fury 325. And of course, Copperhead is the newest of the big four. I feel like this ride was a perfect fit for Carowinds because obviously this park didn't have a launch coaster until this ride was added. But just in terms of scale, like this is less than a third of the size of Fury, and it's honestly not that far off in quality. It's a very solid ride experience. I still prefer Fury, but Copperhead Strike is absolutely amazing. First of all, this attraction is presented very, very well. They have a very solid theme in the queue. They have a bunch of junk laying out in the yard, which is kind of like a Six Flags theme where they like theme their rides to looking like neglect and trash. So that's kind of half of what makes this theme work, but it's still creative. It's a fun and unique vibe that's different from all the other coasters in the park. You have a bunch of signs warning you about snakes, and obviously you have that massive entrance sign right in front of the coaster, which just looks absolutely amazing. Once you get up to the station, you're going to see that these trains look very similar to other Mock Rides trains. I'm very familiar with Manta at SeaWorld because I am a local to Southern California. These restraints feel pretty similar. The major difference is that this ride has a seatbelt while Manta does not. It's kind of weird how the seatbelt connects to the restraint. They ask you not to put it in because the ops tell you that they're gonna close the seatbelt, but I'm pretty sure it's a lot faster if you close the seatbelt. They just undo it and then redo it really quickly. If you don't do it yourself, then they have to reach all the way down, pick up your own seatbelt, and then stick it in. So it's a little faster if you just do it, even though they tell you not to, but you know. So it is a little annoying that they're enforcing that policy on their own operators. Like, I don't see why a guest can't buckle their own seatbelt, because during the ride experience these lap bars will come down a little bit. It doesn't bother me, but we're gonna dig into that later. So after multiple rides in the front row and the back row, I walked away with no preference. So I feel like this ride is really solid in both the front and the back. The element that has the biggest difference is actually going to be the first element, which is the JoJo roll. I feel like you take this element slower in the front row so you have better hang time, but that being said, it's still an insane moment in the back row. This might be the best part of the ride, which is kind of insane to say, but the hang time that you feel on this JoJo roll is just absolutely bonkers. It actually feels like you're gonna fall out. It's crazy. It's amazing. It's really fun. Like, there's a lot of hang time moments that take your butt off of the seat, but this one feels like it takes your butt off of the seat and your back off of the backrest, so it really feels like you're gonna fall out. This is a very solid contender for one of the best hang time moments in the country. And then you're gonna turn around into a little show scene. After riding this ride so many times, I kind of got tired of it. Like, it's the same thing over and over and over again. It's the same set of dialogue. There's no differences, no variation. So I kind of wish they had a couple alternate storylines or alternate interactions. I feel like that could be a pretty interesting way to make this ride a little more re-rideable. And this layout is very re-rideable, so I just kind of wish they included something like that with this pre-show. The screen on the left-hand side doesn't look great. I mean, it's fine. It's certainly a lot more than most Cedar Fair roller coasters, so that's pretty cool. There's also some lighting effects on the left-hand side. A lot of people have criticized this story for not being very clear, and I would agree with that. It's a little confusing. Like, the ride is themed to snakes, but it's not themed to snakes. From what I understand, this is just a massive moonshine operation. The grandma is in charge of it, and her two grandsons are like her goons. So we wander onto her land in the queue there's a bunch of like used and rusted out moonshine equipment, and they're using snakes, like a snake infestation, as like a reason to keep people away from their moonshine operation. So when we wander close enough to see them making the moonshine, we're in trouble. So Granny asks her grandsons to chase us down, and the chase itself is the ride experience. When we hit the brake run, there's a little audio that plays of one of the grandsons saying, "Aw, shucks, we lost them," you know, in one of those funny southern accents, which is pretty cool. So it's a pretty clumsy story. It's not communicated very well, but I do love the logo, and the aesthetic is fine. It's not that big a deal. It is just rather interesting. After that pre-show plays, you're gonna start things off with a launch. And this launch has been made fun of to no end. And honestly, I think it deserves it. This launch is laughably slow. You feel absolutely zero force. Honestly, I feel like the launch on Manta might be more powerful than the launch on Copperhead Strike. But either way, Mock Rides just has really slow launches that aren't forceful at all. But in the grand scheme of this ride, it's not that big a deal in my opinion, because this layout absolutely slaps. So right after the launch, you're going to go straight into the first vertical loop. And just like the JoJo roll, this is also an awesome moment of hang time. I would say the JoJo roll is a little better, but just like the JoJo roll, this one takes your butt off the seat and it takes your back off the backrest. So it's an awesome, awesome hang time moment. It's just not as sustained as the JoJo roll, which is why I prefer that. That being said though, this one does get more points for diversity of forces. You have a decent amount of positive G's when you first crest up into the loop, and then when you stall out and then fall back down, it's just pure hang time, which is really cool. Another thing is that the Stangled dive goes straight through the vertical loop. So when you have that awesome hang time, it looks like you can reach out and touch the Stangle dive, so that's just a really cool visual. So overall, this element is very solid. It's just an awesome, awesome moment. Then right after that, Copperhead is going to throw you into a very powerful airtime hill. This is a really solid camelback. I really like it. It's got a ton of force. It just chucks you out of your seat. It's decently sustained for how small the hill is, so it's really impressive how this ride has a really awesome hang time filled inversion, and then a really powerful airtime hill, like back to back. Like the diversity of forces with a similar amount of speed is just absolutely incredible. I didn't have a preference for this airtime hill in the front or the back, just like for every other element except for the JoJo roll. This is definitely my favorite airtime moment on the ride. It's very solid, and the restraints don't bother me. After that, you're going to curve up into the corkscrew, which is probably the most forgettable inversion on this attraction. It's not whippy, it just feels very proportional, and like it's not that forceful, so you just feel some light forces as you roll right through it. It's pretty forgettable, to be honest. And then you're going to curve up into a helix. This is where I've noticed that in the front row, this ride is absolutely glass smooth. It is very smooth. It's very comfortable. It's awesome. In the back row, it does have a slight shake. It's just a little bit of a jitter. It's nothing to complain about, but it is a little noteworthy. But in the front, this ride is just glass smooth. It's very impressive in the front row. At the end of this helix, there's going to be an airtime hill into the second launch. And this airtime hill blew me away the first time I rode Copperhead Strike. This is a very solid moment as well. It's a very strong moment in the front and the back row. It's a pretty decent pop. It's pretty powerful, but I would say it's less sustained than the camelback earlier in the ride. After that, you're going to have the two most disappointing airtime moments on the entire ride, and they're back to back, which is kind of sad. This launched hill, I feel like it had so much potential. I've been on Pantheon at Busch Gardens Williamsburg, and that launch to airtime hill is probably one of the wildest sequences on any roller coaster I've ever ridden. That swing section on Pantheon is just bonkers, but this launch to airtime hill has basically nothing, like in the front or the back, no airtime. You just kind of roll over it. So I guess it has a different dynamic to like 90% of launches out there, but it's still pretty disappointing. Like I've been on 3 launched hills. Obviously Pantheon is the best one, and Pipeline is much better than the launched hill on Copperhead Strike. When I first saw the animation, I got really excited for this moment. I was like, wow, I'm sure that's gonna be such a cool moment, feeling airtime while you're accelerating, but you just don't feel the airtime, so that's kind of a bummer. And then the step up is a very light pop. Like you might get more in the front than the back, but it's really not that noteworthy. It's pretty disappointing. So these 2 hills are by far the weakest on Copperhead Strike, and because they come right after one another, they really stand out as kind of a weak spot on the attraction. A funny story is on one of my rides, I actually got stopped on this launch. So I thought we might have to get evac'd, but the launch sequence actually recovers itself. So we stopped in between the two hills, like after the drop into the launch and before the launched hill itself. After like 5 to 10 minutes of just sitting there and listening to a bunch of people talk to each other about how crazy this is, we started rolling forward at a very slow speed, and then we parked at the end of the launch, and then we went backwards. It was like a very slow backwards launch, and we started to roll back up that airtime hill before the second launch, and then the launch pulled us through the whole thing, and it sent us through the second half of the ride. And when that happened, you might think that I got to experience a little more force, but it felt literally identical. There was no extra force. It felt the same. I think it's really funny that mock rides needed the recovery sequence to be a swing launch. Copperhead Strike isn't that tall. I believe it's under 100 feet, but the second launch isn't strong enough to send you over the inverted top hat, which is just really funny to me. But that was definitely a unique situation, and I'm kind of happy that happened to me. So anyway, getting back to the layout, the inverted top hat is the third best hang time moment on the attraction. So obviously this is the highest off the ground, so it has that really neat visual, but it is the least sustained, obviously because you're moving fastest through this inversion. And another thing is that the restraint is probably a little further down on you than it was earlier in the ride. But to be honest, the mock rides lap bars are really solid restraints. I feel like even when you're stapled, you can still feel the forces, so it's really not that big a deal. Like, I can still feel the hang time even if you're stapled, and it doesn't like lock down like incredibly tight, so you can still feel forces. That's coming from multiple rides on Copperhead Strike and dozens of rides on Manta at SeaWorld. So after that, you're gonna whiz through a bank turn. It's a little forceful, but it's not incredibly powerful or anything. Like, it's just sort of there. And then you have the second vertical loop. Both of the loops on Copperhead Strike are very circular. They're just like a Schwarzkopf loop, but you take this one with a lot more speed, so it actually feels like a Schwarzkopf loop. I rode Montezuma's Revenge so many times. Before I went to Carowinds, I got to ride Colossus at Lagoon like a week or two before I went there, so it feels a lot like those Schwarzkopf loops, which is really cool for a modern roller coaster to have those circular loops, because when you think of a circular loop, you think of Schwarzkopf, and when you think of Schwarzkopf, you think of something that's long gone, that's never going to happen again. So it's really cool that a modern launch coaster has a circular loop. Like, that force, it just feels totally different from those teardrop loops that 99% of roller coasters have. So it's just so much fun to roll through that. Plus, the two loops have like identical profiling, but it just feels so different because you take it with so much more speed. So I really appreciate that even though Copperhead has two of the same element, they feel very different. Like, you compare that to two loops on rides like Montu or Kraken at SeaWorld, like the two loops feel pretty identical because they're profiled the same, and you take them with a proportional amount of speed, while the second loop on Copperhead you take with a lot more speed than the first one, and they're about the same size. So it's just so cool. I really like that. Like, you get heavy positive G's coming up and coming out of it, and at the top you slow down just for a brief moment, but it's not enough to give hang time, so it feels just like that loop on Montezuma, which at this point I really miss. I don't know what Knott's Berry Farm's doing. Anyway, the valley after the second loop is by far the most intense part of Copperhead Strike. That's a really solid moment of positive G-force, and then you get thrown into the Stangle Dive, which is an absolutely awesome pop of sideways airtime. I love sideways airtime on any roller coaster. This element is very impressive. Looking at the profiling of the track, you might figure that the airtime would be stronger in the left seat. I rode the attraction multiple times in the left seat and multiple times in the right seat, and honestly, I felt that it gave an awesome pop on both sides of the train, which is really cool. I'm glad that's the case. It's not like that one element on Velocicoaster where you get an awesome pop on the right hand side of the train and like nothing on the left. So I'm glad that Copperhead gives awesome sideways airtime to everyone on the train. Front, back, middle, left, or right, you're gonna get sideways airtime on this moment. So this is just absolutely awesome. It's not very sustained, but just sideways airtime at all is just absolutely wild, and it's a really strong pop, just like the other solid moments of airtime on Copperhead. After that, you're gonna dive down into a really awesome transition. It's kind of like this ride turns into Maverick for just a brief moment. Like, this actually feels like a Maverick transition, and it's kind of an airtime moment because the transition is so sharp that it feels like your body has to catch up with the train. So it rips your butt off of the seat, and then you have to catch up with your seat as it transitions in the opposite direction. So it's just a really awesome moment, and it kind of caught me off guard during my 2024 rides because I have no memory of liking it that much in 2022. So this sequence with the top hat, the turn, the Schwarzkopf loop, the Stengel dive, and then the Maverick transition back to back to back are all incredibly impressive. This is my favorite sequence on Copperhead Strike. It's just absolutely amazing. It follows up those 2 weak airtime hills with the best part of the ride, so that's very impressive. It's a really solid layout, and the fact that Copperhead Strike goes through both of its own loops is really impressive, especially since the first loop is pierced by the Stengel dive, which is much later in the ride. That's really impressive to me, and it just feels so creative. Like, I love rides that go through their own loop. That's just really satisfying for my brain, and it's really satisfying as a rider just to see that. Like, it makes it feel really planned out. It makes it feel interesting to watch and to ride, so it's genius, and the fact that Copperhead does it twice is very interesting. I just love that. Like, Time Traveler does that as well at Silver Dollar City, so Mock Rides just has some brilliant layouts, and I believe Copperhead Strike is one of those brilliant layouts. That being said, after the Maverick transition, you enter the Spaghetti Bowl section, which is probably the most forgettable part of Copperhead Strike. Like, you go through some turns, which are pretty inconsistent. Like, some have decent amount of positive G's, and some you just kind of coast through. The one with the most positive G's is the one that dives down near the second airtime hill. It looks like there's enough room to go under that hill, so I kind of wish it went under the hill and then came back over to that side. But I know this ride was really expensive, so I can't complain too much. So that's a decent moment of positive G's. Other than that, you're just going to go through a bunch of these turns. There's an airtime hill that isn't really an airtime hill that probably should have been profiled to give more airtime, so that's a little disappointing. But Copperhead Strike redeems itself by throwing in one more sharp moment of airtime before it throws you into the brakes. So I absolutely love this layout. This might be one of my favorite layouts of all time. It's just a spectacular showcase of different forces you can feel on a roller coaster. Like, you got decent positive G's on inversions with the corkscrew and the second vertical loop. You have insane hang time with the JoJo roll, the first vertical loop, and the top hat. And you have spectacular airtime moments with the camelback and the drop into the second launch. And of course, you have the insane sideways airtime moment. So you pretty much have anything that you could ever want from any roller coaster on Copperhead Strike. And this is the only roller coaster at Carowinds that gives airtime and it goes upside down. So that's just really impressive. Obviously, the weakest point are those 2 hills back to back, and of course the launches. But other than that, there's not that much to complain about. Like, it's a really solid ride length, and it just has so many different forces that it's impossible to get bored with Copperhead Strike. So this is just an amazing roller coaster, and I'm really glad that I got to ride it so many times. One thing I do have to mention about this attraction, though, is the reliability. Out of the big 4 roller coasters at Carowinds, this was by far the most unreliable. It's not the most unreliable in the park, though, because Nighthawk was closed for all 3 days of my 2024 visit. But Copperhead Strike did go down quite a bit. I didn't get to ride it in the rain. It was the only roller coaster out of the big 4 that I didn't get to ride in the rain, and I didn't get to ride at night. So that's kind of a shame. I don't know if the LSMs just can't function in the rain, and when I visited Carowinds, it was in July, and they had a couple rainstorms roll through over those few days, so that's too bad. So I just absolutely love Copperhead Strike. The diversity of forces is very impressive. The hang time moments are wild, the airtime moments are really strong, the restraints don't bother me at all, and of course it has decent moments of positive G-forces. The hang time on the top hat might be more impressive than the hang time on the only hang time moment on hang time. It also might be taller, which is actually kind of funny. And of course, the top hat is like the 3rd best moment of hang time on Copperhead Strike compared to the only hang time moment on hang time, which of course is the best moment of hang time on hang time. But I think we have had enough hang time for this video. So thank you so much for watching. Thank you for listening. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and I will catch you later.